The morning of December 30th, 2016. The day after President Barack Obama imposed sanctions on Russia for the interference in the 2016 US election, Tillman Werner sat down to breakfast in Bonn, Germany. He was looking online at his dining table, catching up on the latest news. The story about the sanctions had broken overnight, and Werner, a researcher at the cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike, was still processing the details. Clicking on a link to official statement, he saw that the White House had targeted a large list. While most of the list blended together, one name caught his attention: Evgeniy Bogachev. It turned out that Werner knew a lot about Bogachev. Bogachev was known online as Slavic, and he had spent several years looting and terrorizing the global financial system. Werner had first-hand experience battling against Bogachev's operations. Bogachev was a notorious cyber bank robber. In fact, he was one of the best in the world. He orchestrated attacks through his malware, Game Over Zeus, which resulted in more than $100 million of stolen funds. But his true identity was unknown for the longest time. And when they found out who he really was, they announced a $3 million reward for anyone who could find him. This is the hunt for Russia's most wanted hacker. Most of the information in this video came from the writer Garrett Graff. A link to his article will be in the description. America's battle with Russia's most notorious cyber criminal started in the spring of 2009, when FBI Special Agent James Craig, a rookie at the time, started investigating two unusual cases of cybercrime. At just 6 months into his career, Craig was relatively new to the job, but his superiors chose him for the case because of his unique qualifications. Before becoming an agent, he had spent years working as an IT specialist for the FBI. In college, his peers had nicknamed him the Silent Geek. The primary victim in the case was a subdivision of the major payment processor, First Data, which suffered a $450,000 loss that May. This was soon followed by a client of the First National Bank of Omaha losing $100,000. What struck Craig as odd was that both crimes appeared to have been carried out from the victim's own IP addresses, using their own login credentials. Upon further investigation, he discovered that the infected computers were all compromised with the same piece of malware. It was known as the Zeus Trojan horse. In the online security world, Craig learned, Zeus was infamous. First surfacing in 2006, it gained a reputation as a masterpiece of cybercrime, sleek, efficient, and adaptable. Its creator, however, was a mystery, known only by a series of aliases online, including Slavic, Lucky12345, and several other handles. Zeus spread using common online tactics, such as fake IRS emails or fraudulent UPS shipping notices designed to trick recipients into downloading the malicious files. Once installed on a victim's computer, the Zeus Trojan granted hackers virtually godlike control over the system. With it, they could seize control of websites, use keyloggers to capture sensitive data like usernames, passwords, and pins, and even modify login forms to request additional private information, such as a mother's maiden name or a social security number. This technique is known as a man-in-the-middle browser attack, and it was particularly subtle. While the victim thought they were securely logging into websites, the malware would subtly alter the page before it loaded, stealing the user's credentials and siphoning funds from their accounts. The victim wouldn't even realize the theft until they logged into their account from a different device and discovered their balance had vanished. By the time James Craig took on the case in 2009, Zeus had become the malware of choice for cyber criminals, a dominant force in the digital underground, much like Microsoft Office is in the business world. Its creator, Slavic, was a rare breed in the world of online crime, a true professional. Unlike most malware authors, Slavic constantly refined and updated the Zeus code, regularly beta testing new features to ensure his creation remained effective and adaptable. The malware was versatile, with different variants tailored for specific types of attacks and targets. For example, it could be used to hijack online accounts, create botnets that could be used for purposes like sending spam, launching distributed denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks, or distributing more malicious emails to expand the malware's reach. But just before Craig began his investigation, Slavic shifted his strategy. Instead of focusing on wide-scale infections, he began to gather an elite circle of online criminals. He provided a carefully selected group with a more advanced version of his malware called Jabba Zeus. This variant included a Jabber instant messaging plugin, which allowed the group to communicate and coordinate their attacks more efficiently, like in the case of the Omaha thefts. This move marked a shift from indiscriminate infection to highly targeted strikes, specifically focusing on corporate accountants and individuals with access to financial systems. As Slavic increasingly aligned himself with organized crime, he scaled back his malware operations significantly. In 2010, he announced his retirement from the scene and released an upgraded version of his malware, which security researchers would later dub Zeus 2.1. This new iteration was far more sophisticated, featuring encryption that tied each copy of the malware to a specific user, making it much harder to trace. The price for this advanced version was steep, upwards of $10,000 per copy. With this move, Slavic shifted his focus exclusively to a select group of elite, highly ambitious criminals. We had no idea how big this case was, Craig recalls. The level of activity from these guys was staggering. Soon, other institutions began to report similar losses and fraud incidents, lots of them. Craig soon realized that from his desk in suburban Omaha, he was tracking a highly organized international criminal syndicate. The victims just started falling out of the sky, he says. The scale of the operation was unlike anything the FBI had ever dealt with before. Craig had a breakthrough in the case in September 2009. With the help of industry experts, he pinpointed a New York-based server that appeared to be integral to the Zeus network. After securing a search warrant, Craig's team seized the server's data, copying it onto a hard drive and shipping it overnight to Nebraska. When the drive was examined by an engineer in Omaha, he paused in disbelief. It contained tens of thousands of instant message chat logs in Russian and Ukrainian. Turning to Craig, the engineer said, "You have their Jabber server." What they had uncovered was the heart of the gang's entire digital operation, a treasure trove of evidence that would serve as a roadmap for the entire investigation. The cybersecurity firm Mandiant sent an engineer to Omaha for months to help understand the complex Jabber Zeus code, while the FBI began rotating agents from other field offices on 30 or 90-day assignments. Skilled professionals nationwide were called in to help decode the chat logs. The slang was a challenge, Craig says. The logs contained information to hundreds of victims, with the files scattered with their stolen credentials in English. Craig and his team began calling businesses, informing them that they had been victims of cyber fraud. In several cases, companies had already fired employees they suspected of involvement, unaware that those workers' computers had been infected with malware and that their login details had been stolen. The case soon spilled over into the real world. In 2009, 3 young women from Kazakhstan walked into the FBI field office in New York with a bizarre story. They had come to the United States to search for work, but had found themselves caught up in an unusual scheme. They would be driven by a man to a local bank and instruct them to open a new account. They would explain to the bank tellers that they were students visiting for the summer. A few days would pass, and the man would bring them back to withdraw all the money from the account. They were allowed to keep a small portion, but the rest was handed over to him. Agents quickly detected that these women were money mules, people recruited to help launder the stolen funds that Slavic and his network had passed through legitimate bank accounts. By the summer of 2010, investigators in New York had alerted banks across the region to be on the lookout for suspicious withdrawals and to contact the FBI when they occurred. The tip led to dozens of mules, cashing out tens of thousands of dollars. Many of them were students or recent immigrants living in places like Brighton Beach. One woman admitted to becoming a mule after a job at a grocery store fell through, telling an agent, "I could strip or I could do this." Another man explained that his daily routine involved being picked up at 9 a.m, running cash-out operations until 3 p.m, and then spending the rest of the day at the beach. The amounts withdrawn usually hovered around $9,000, just below the threshold that would trigger federal reporting requirements. The mules typically received 5 to 10% of the total withdrawal, with a portion of that going to the recruiter. The rest of the money was funneled overseas. The United States, however, was just one piece of a much larger multinational fraud network. Investigators soon traced similar mule operations to countries like Romania, the Czech Republic, the United Kingdom, Ukraine, and Russia. By their estimates, the group had stolen between $70 million and $80 million, but they suspected the total losses were much higher. Banks were frantic, demanding that the FBI take immediate action to stop the fraud and stem the growing losses. Over the summer, New York agents began zeroing in on the high-level recruiters and masterminds behind the scheme operating within the US. In one instance, 2 Moldovans were arrested at a Milwaukee hotel at 11 p.m. after a tip-off. In another, a suspect in Boston tried to escape a raid, but had to be rescued from a fire escape. Meanwhile, Craig's investigation in Omaha was progressing against the broader Zeus network. The FBI and the Justice Department had traced the gang's leadership to eastern Ukraine, specifically the city of Donetsk. There, several key figures in the Zeus operation were believed to be based. Alexei Bron, known online as the Head, was responsible for laundering and moving the stolen funds globally. Ivan Viktorovich Klepikov, who went by the handle Petrovich, oversaw the group's IT infrastructure, including web hosting and domain management. Vyacheslav Igorovich Penchukov, a local DJ nicknamed Tank, was the mastermind who ran the entire operation, making him second in command to Slavic. Most of them still in their 20s, the level of organisation these guys were able to pull off would have impressed any Fortune 100 company, Craig says. The gang's enormous profits were funneled into lavish lifestyles. The chat logs were filled with talk of extravagant vacations to destinations like Turkey, Crimea, and the United Arab Emirates, illustrating just how far-reaching and luxurious their criminal enterprise had become. By the fall of 2010, the FBI would be ready to take down the Zeus network. As officials in Washington prepared for a high-profile press conference, Craig found himself on a grueling 12-hour train ride across Ukraine, headed for Donetsk. There, he would meet with agents from the Ukrainian security service to raid the homes of Tank and Petrovich. When they arrived at Klepikov's apartment, a Ukrainian agent asked Craig to show his FBI badge. "Show him it's not just us," the agent urged. Craig was taken aback by the scene. The hacker, Klepikov, stood nonchalantly in his purple velvet smoking jacket as agents sifted through his disorganized apartment in a crumbling Soviet-era building. His wife, holding their baby, chatted with investigators in the kitchen, laughing. "This is the gang I've been chasing," Craig thought. The raids went on late into the night, and Craig didn't return to his hotel until 3 a.m. He took nearly 20 terabytes of seized data back with him to Omaha. In total, 39 arrests were made across 4 countries, significantly disrupting the network. But several key players slipped through the cracks. One major mule recruiter in the US managed to flee westward, staying one step ahead of investigators in Las Vegas and Los Angeles before eventually escaping the country inside a shipping container. More critically, Slavic, the mastermind behind the entire operation, remained elusive. Investigators assumed he was hiding out in Russia, one time in an online chat. He casually mentioned being married, but that was all they had. The formal indictment referred to him only by his online alias. Craig didn't even know what Slavic looked like. "We have thousands of photos from Tank and Petrovich, but not a single image of Slavic," Craig says. Soon after, even his digital footprints disappeared. Slavic, whoever he was, went dark. About a year after the FBI shut down the Zeus network, the small but dedicated community of online cybersecurity researchers began to notice a new variant of Zeus making the rounds. The source code of the malware had been leaked online in 2011, whether intentionally or by accident, and this effectively turned Zeus into an open source project, leading to a surge of new variants. However, the version that caught the attention of researchers was different. It was more powerful, more sophisticated, and especially advanced in how it assembled botnets. Previously, most botnets operated using a hub and spoke model. In this setup, a hacker would set up a central command server to send orders directly to machines that were infected, known as zombie computers. These machines, in turn, would be directed to carry out tasks like sending spam emails, distributing more malware, or launching denial of service attacks on websites. The hub and spoke system, however, had a vulnerability. If law enforcement or security researchers could take down the command server, whether by seizing it, knocking it offline, or disrupting the hacker's ability to communicate with it, they could usually dismantle the entire botnet. The new variant of Zeus was far more resilient. It combined traditional command servers with peer-to-peer communication between infected machines, making it much harder to take down. Infected devices kept an updated list of other compromised machines. If one machine lost its connection to the command server, it could rely on the peer-to-peer network to locate a new server and continue receiving commands. This decentralized approach made the botnet far more difficult to disrupt, as there was no single point of failure for investigators to target. The network basically built to be nearly impossible to dismantle. From the very beginning, it was designed with resilience in mind. As soon as one command server was taken offline, the botnet's operator could quickly set up a new one and redirect the peer-to-peer network to it. This made it incredibly difficult to shut down. The new version of the malware was dubbed Game Over Zeus, named after one of its file names. The name also lent itself to a bit of dark humour. Once the malware infected your computer, went the joke, it was game over for your bank account. It became clear that Game Over Zeus was being controlled by a highly elite group of hackers, and at the helm was Slavic. The notorious cybercriminal had resurfaced, more powerful and more organised than ever. His new criminal syndicate came to be known as the Business Club, a September 2011 internal announcement from the group, which introduced new online tools for managing money transfers and recruiting mules, ended with a warm message for its members. We wish you all successful and productive work. Just like the Jabba Zeus network, the Business Club network had one primary goal: to rob banks. But this new operation was even more sophisticated and ruthless. The method was multifaceted. First, the Game Over Zeus malware would steal a victim's banking credentials. Then, the Business Club would quickly drain the account, transferring the stolen funds to other accounts they controlled, often overseas. The group would launch a denial of service DDoS attack on the targeted financial institution. This served two purposes. It distracted bank employees and prevented customers from realizing their accounts had been emptied until after the funds had already been transferred. On November 6, 2012, the FBI tracked the Game Over network as it stole $6.9 million in a single transaction, then followed up with a multi-day DDoS attack on the bank to create a diversion. Unlike the earlier Jabba Zeus gang, the more sophisticated network behind Game Over Zeus shifted its focus to larger scale thefts, often in the 6 and 7 figure range, making smaller bank withdrawals in places like Brooklyn seem obsolete. Instead, they exploited the global banking system, hiding their massive heists within the trillions of dollars in legitimate transactions that flow through international commerce each day. Investigators pinpointed two key areas in far eastern China, near the Russian city of Vladivostok, where mules funneled vast sums of stolen money into Business Club accounts. This strategy, they realized, was a game changer for organized crime. The bank robbers no longer needed a physical presence in the US. They could carry out everything remotely, never needing to step foot inside any US jurisdiction. That's all it takes to operate with impunity, said Leo Tadeo, a former senior FBI official. But banks weren't the only targets for Slavic and his crew. They also raided the accounts of businesses, both large and small, non-profits, and even individuals. In October 2013, the group began deploying a new malware variant called CryptoLocker, a form of ransomware that encrypted the files on an infected machine and demanded a ransom payment, usually between $300 and $500, to unlock them. CryptoLocker quickly became a favorite tool of the Business Club, primarily because it offered a way to turn their vast army of idle zombie computers into a source of profit. While the high-level financial fraud they orchestrated through the botnet didn't always yield quick returns, ransomware provided an alternative revenue stream. Most of the infected computers were not connected to lucrative corporate accounts, so CryptoLocker allowed the criminals to monetize the otherwise dormant machines. Though the concept of ransomware had existed since the 1990s, CryptoLocker brought it into the mainstream. It typically spread through seemingly innocuous email attachments, and once installed, it used strong encryption to lock the victim's files, demanding payment in Bitcoin for their release. It was a costly and inconvenient experience for many victims, but the pressure to recover critical data often led them to pay. In November 2013, the Swansea, Massachusetts Police Department reluctantly paid $750 to unlock one of their computers. It's so complicated and successful that you have to buy these bitcoins, which we had never heard of, said Lieutenant Gregory Ryan, explaining the situation to his local newspaper. The following month, the Dell SecureWorks security firm estimated that up to 250,000 machines worldwide had been infected with CryptoLocker in 2013. One researcher tracked 771 ransom payments, which collectively earned Slavic's crew a staggering $1.1 million. He was one of the first to realize just how desperate people would be to regain access to their files. He didn't charge an exorbitant amount, but he made a lot of money and created a new type of online crime. As the Game Over Zeus network continued to grow, its operators diversified their revenue streams. They began renting out their botnet to other cyber criminals for a variety of illicit activities, including delivering malware, sending spam, and executing click fraud schemes. In these scams, zombie machines were used to generate revenue by clicking on ads on fake websites, enriching the criminals behind the network. With each passing week, the financial toll of Game Over grew, leaving a trail of destruction for banks, businesses, and individuals. For companies, a single theft could wipe out an entire year's worth of profits, or worse. Victims included a regional bank in North Florida and a Native American tribe in Washington state. As Game Over expanded its reach across the private sector, it began to absorb more and more of the cybersecurity industry's resources. The scale of the thefts was mind-boggling. I don't think anyone has a full grasp of the extent. One $5 million theft overshadows hundreds of smaller ones, explains Michael Sandy, a security expert at the Dutch firm Foxit. When a bank is attacked repeatedly, 100 transactions a week, you stop worrying about the specific malware or individual attacks. You just need to stop the bleeding. Many tried to stop the relentless attacks. Between 2011 and 2013, cybersecurity researchers and various firms launched 3 major attempts to take down Game Over Zeus. The first came in the spring of 2012, when 3 European researchers joined forces for an initial assault. Slavic quickly repelled their attack. Later that year, in March 2012, Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit took legal action against the network, enlisting US Marshals to raid data centers in Illinois and Pennsylvania that housed Zeus command and control servers. Microsoft also targeted 39 individuals believed to be connected to the Zeus networks, with Slavic topping the list. But the effort fell short. Instead of crippling Game Over, Microsoft's move only alerted Slavic to the investigators' knowledge of his operation, allowing him to adjust and refine his tactics. Botnet hunters are a small, tight-knit community of engineers and cybersecurity researchers, self-named internet janitors, dedicated to keeping online networks clean and running smoothly. Within this group, Tillman Werner, a tall, lanky German researcher at the security firm CrowdStrike, had gained a reputation for his enthusiasm and skill in the field. In February 2013, Werner made waves when he took control of the notorious Kellyhouse botnet, a malware network built around Viagra spam. But while Kellyhouse was notorious, Werner knew it wasn't Game Over Zeus. He had been watching the Game Over network since its early days, impressed by its sophistication and resilience. In 2012, Werner teamed up with Brett Stone Gross, fresh out of graduate school and based in California, along with a few other researchers, to develop a plan to take down Game Over Zeus. Working across 2 continents and mostly in their spare time, the team coordinated their efforts via online chat, carefully analysing the previous European attempt to dismantle the botnet. They spent nearly a year preparing their attack, identifying where others had failed and planning a more refined approach. By January 2013, they were ready. Armed with pizza and caffeine, they braced themselves for what they knew could be a lengthy siege against Slavic's network. When you go against a botnet, Werner said, you get one shot. It either goes right or wrong. Their strategy was to reroute Game Over's peer-to-peer network, centralize its traffic, and then redirect it to a new server they controlled, a technique known as sinkholing. The goal was to sever the botnet's communication link to Slavic and regain control of the infected machines. In the beginning, everything went according to plan. Slavic made no attempt to stop them, and Werner and Stonegross watched as more and more infected computers connected to their sinkhole hour by hour. At the height of their attack, the researchers had control over 99% of Slavic's network, but they had overlooked a critical flaw in their strategy. A small group of infected computers was still secretly communicating with Slavic's command servers. We missed the second layer of control, Stonegross admits. By the second week, Slavic was able to push a software update across his entire botnet, reasserting his dominance. The researchers watched in growing disbelief as a new version of Game Over Zeus spread across the internet, and the botnet's peer-to-peer network began to rebuild itself. We immediately realized what had happened. We'd completely neglected this other channel of communication, Werner says. The researchers' months of planning, 9 months to be exact, had collapsed. Slavic had won, in a triumphant and mocking online chat with the Polish security team.
He gloated about how every attempt to take down his network had failed.
I don't think he ever thought it was possible to take down his botnet, Werner reflects. Disheartened but determined, the two researchers were resolved to try again, but this time they knew they would need additional help.
Over the past decade,
the FBI's Pittsburgh field office has become the driving force behind some of the government's largest cybercrime indictments, largely due to the leadership of J. Keith Malarski, the head of the local cyber squad. Malarski, a former furniture salesman, is an energetic and outgoing agent who has become something of a celebrity in cybersecurity circles. Malarski joined the FBI in the late 90s and spent his first 7 years working on espionage and terrorism cases in Washington, D.C. In 2005, he eagerly returned to his hometown, joining a new cyber initiative in the Pittsburgh office, despite his limited knowledge of computers at the time. He quickly immersed himself in the field, going undercover in a 2-year investigation targeting identity thieves operating in the online forum Dark Market. Using the alias Master Splinter, Malarski rose to the role of Dark Market Administrator, placing himself at the heart of a growing online criminal community. His undercover work even brought him into contact with Slavic, and he was able to review an early version of the Zeus malware. Malarski's access to Dark Market eventually led to the arrest of 60 criminals across 3 continents. In the years that followed, Malarski and his team doubled down on fighting cybercrime, recognizing its increasing significance. By 2014, agents in Malarski's squad, along with colleagues from the National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance,
a Pittsburgh-based institution,
were spearheading some of the Justice Department's most high-profile cases. Among their investigations were the hackers behind Game Over Zeus, as well as a separate case that would ultimately indict 5 Chinese army hackers for infiltrating major US corporations like Westinghouse and US Steel to benefit Chinese industrial interests. By the time Werner and Stonegross offered to collaborate with the Pittsburgh squad to take down Slavic's Game Over Zeus botnet, the FBI's investigation had been underway for about a year. Had they approached any other law enforcement agency, the response might have been different. At the time, cooperation between government agencies and private industry was still relatively rare. The FBI's approach to cybercrime had long been to gather industry intelligence without much transparency or information sharing. But the Pittsburgh team was different. Known for their collaborative approach, they recognized the value of working alongside experts in the field. They understood that Werner and Stonegross were 2 of the best in the business. We jumped at the chance, Malarski says.
It quickly became clear that in order to bring down Game Over Zeus,
they needed to tackle the problem from 3 fronts simultaneously. First, they had to identify who was behind the botnet and build a solid case for criminal prosecution. Despite millions of dollars in stolen funds, neither the FBI nor the cybersecurity community had so much as a single name linked to the business club. Second, they needed to dismantle the botnet's digital infrastructure, something Werner and Stonegross were uniquely equipped to handle. Third, they had to target and seize the botnet's physical infrastructure, which meant gathering court orders and coordinating with international authorities to shut down servers scattered across the globe. Once those steps were in place, the final piece of the puzzle would be to partner with private sector companies who would be ready to deploy security patches and software updates to help clean and recover the infected machines once the authorities gained control. Without all 3 pieces of the plan, the mission was likely to fail, just as prior attempts had. With the scope of the operation clear, Malarski and his squad set about assembling an unprecedented international partnership. They reached out to law enforcement agencies in the UK, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Ukraine, Luxembourg, and over a dozen other countries. Simultaneously, they brought in industry giants like Microsoft, CrowdStrike, McAfee, Dell SecureWorks, and others to contribute their expertise. It was a monumental cross-border effort, the likes of which had never been attempted before by the US government. To help uncover Slavic's identity and gather critical intelligence on the business club, the FBI partnered with Foxit, a highly respected Dutch cybersecurity firm known for its expertise in cyber forensics.
The team at Foxit
began by tracing old usernames and email addresses linked to Slavic's network, carefully reconstructing the inner workings of the group. It soon became clear that the business club was a loose collective of around 50 criminals, each paying an initiation fee to gain access to the advanced control panels of the Game Over Zeus botnet. The network operated through two password-protected British websites, visitcoastweekend.com and work.businessclub.so, which housed detailed records, FAQs, and a ticket system for addressing technical issues. Once the FBI obtained legal permission to access the servers, they discovered a highly organised ledger that tracked the group's ongoing frauds in meticulous detail. Everything about the operation screamed professionalism, says Michael Sandy, a Foxit researcher. When it came to pinpointing the exact timing of financial transactions, he adds, they probably knew more about the timing and flow of money than the banks themselves. After months of following leads, the Foxit investigators received a tip about an email address that seemed worth checking. It was one of many similar tips they had pursued, but this one would prove critical. We had a lot of breadcrumbs, Mulaski recalls, but this particular lead led to something crucial. The team traced the email address to a British server that Slavic had used to host the business club websites. More investigative work and several court orders eventually guided them to Russian social media sites, where the email address was tied to a real name,
Evgeniy Bogachev.
At first, the name meant little to the team. It took weeks of additional work
before they realised that this was the elusive figure behind Zeus and the business club.
The mastermind known only by his online alias, Slavic. They discovered that Slavic was a 30-year-old who lived a comfortable, upper-middle-class life in Anapa, a resort city on Russia's Black Sea coast. Investigators found online photos of him enjoying leisurely activities with his wife and young daughter. One picture showed him in leopard print pajamas and dark sunglasses, holding a large cat. They learned that he had written the first version of Zeus when he was only 22 years old. But the most astonishing discovery came as the Dutch investigators delved deeper into Bogachev's activity. They found that someone at the helm of Game Over Zeus had been repeatedly searching tens of thousands of the botnet's infected machines for email addresses linked to Georgian intelligence officers, high-ranking Turkish police officials, and documents marked with classified Ukrainian information. The searches also included material connected to the Syrian conflict and Russian arms dealing. At that moment, the team had a breakthrough. These are espionage commands, says Sandy. Game Over Zeus wasn't just a highly sophisticated piece of criminal malware. It was also an advanced tool for intelligence gathering. As investigators pieced things together, it became clear that the botnet's capabilities went far beyond just stealing bank credentials. Bogachev seemed to be running a covert intelligence operation under the radar of even the world's most notorious cyber criminals.
While the FBI and Foxit
couldn't find concrete evidence linking him directly to the Russian government, there were clear indications that someone, likely an intelligence agency, was feeding specific search terms to Slavic's botnet, directing it to gather sensitive data from across the globe. The investigators began to suspect that Bogachev was, in fact, a Russian intelligence asset. In March 2014, the connection between the botnet's criminal activity and espionage became undeniable. As Russia moved to annex Crimea and destabilize Ukraine's eastern borders, the investigators observed Bogachev redirecting a portion of his botnet to search for politically sensitive information on infected Ukrainian machines. The botnet was actively trawling for intelligence that could provide insight into Ukraine's military strategies and political developments, seemingly aligned with Russia's military objectives. From this, the team constructed a tentative theory about Bogachev's role in state-backed espionage. It appeared that his criminal enterprise was not just a money-making scheme, but a tool used by Russian intelligence for covert operations. The connection to the state helped explain how Bogachev had been able to operate with such impunity. It also provided new context for the evolution of Zeus. Around 2010,
when Bogachev had briefly faked his retirement from the malware scene
and started limiting access to his code, investigators now believed he may have attracted the attention of Russian security services. In exchange for being allowed to continue his criminal activities without prosecution, outside of Russia at least, it seemed plausible that the state had made certain demands. To execute these tasks efficiently and without detection, Bogachev had tightened control over his botnet, making it more exclusive and harder to trace. The discovery of Slavic's potential ties to Russian intelligence added a layer of complexity to the plan to take down Game Over Zeus, especially when it came to coordinating with Russian authorities. This potential diplomatic issue aside, the operation was progressing steadily, with investigators zeroing in on Bogachev. The time had finally come to present a grand jury indictment, formally naming him as the mastermind behind Game Over Zeus. American prosecutors quickly mobilized to secure the civil court orders needed to seize and disrupt the botnet. "We had 9 people on this case," says Michael Comber from the US Attorney's Office in Pittsburgh, "and we only had 55 total staff." Over several months, the team worked methodically with internet service providers, seeking permission to take down Game Over's proxy service. This careful coordination would ensure that when the time came, they could disable Slavic's control over the network by flipping those servers. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security, Carnegie Mellon University, and various antivirus companies readied their resources to help affected users regain control of their infected machines. Weekly calls spanned multiple continents as authorities in the US, Britain, and beyond worked in sync. By late spring 2014, with pro-Russian forces actively fighting in Ukraine, the American-led team prepared for their long-anticipated takedown of Game Over. They had spent more than a year meticulously reverse engineering the malware, monitoring the gang's chat logs to understand their inner workings, and tracing the physical servers that kept the botnet running worldwide. By this point, the researchers knew the malware better than the author, says Elliot Peterson, one of the lead FBI agents on the case. As Malarski reflects, the team had covered all their bases. Criminally, we can do it. Civilly, we can do it. Technically, we can do it. With a vast coordinated effort involving dozens of people, more than 70 internet service providers, and law enforcement agencies from countries including Canada, the UK, Japan, and Italy, the team was ready to launch their operation on Friday, May 30th. The week leading up to the takedown was a whirlwind of chaos. When Werner and Stonegross arrived in Pittsburgh, Peterson invited them to his family's apartment. There, his kids stared curiously at Werner's German accent as they shared a meal and a few fathead beers. Over dinner, the team took stock of the high-stakes operation ahead. Time was quickly running out. Werner's code wasn't nearly ready, and the clock was ticking. Throughout the week, Werner and Stonegross scrambled to finalize the software, while another group raced to secure the final court orders. Meanwhile, an ad hoc coalition of 24 governments, private companies, and consultants worked tirelessly to coordinate the takedown. The White House had been briefed and was eagerly awaiting results, but as the days wore on, it felt as if the plan might unravel before they even got started. A major setback came just days before the attack, when the team discovered an unexpected twist. While they had known for months that the Game Over botnet was controlled by a server in Canada, they had only just learned of a second command server in Ukraine. The revelation hit hard. "If we didn't even know about the second server," Werner said, "how can we be sure there isn't a third we haven't found?" On Thursday, Stonegross spent the day walking more than a dozen internet service providers through the necessary procedures for the takedown. But just before the attack, one critical service provider suddenly backed out, afraid of the potential backlash from Slavic's group. Then, on Friday morning, as Werner and Stonegross arrived at their office building along the Monongahela River, they were hit with another blow. McAfee, one of their key partners, had prematurely posted a blog titled "It's Game Over" for Zeus and CryptoLocker, revealing the details of the takedown to the public before the operation even began. The timing couldn't have been worse. After frantic calls to get McAfee's premature blog post taken down, the takedown operation finally began. Canadian and Ukrainian authorities swiftly took down Game Over's command servers, knocking each one offline in quick succession. Meanwhile, Werner and Stonegross began redirecting the botnet's infected machines into a sinkhole they had carefully set up, a digital trap designed to absorb the digital traffic and block the business club's access to its own systems. But things didn't go smoothly at first. For hours, the attacks seemed to stall. The researchers were scrambling to identify bugs in their code, unable to figure out what was going wrong. By 1 PM, Their sinkhole had absorbed only about 100 infected machines, far less than the 500,000 devices they had hoped to target. Behind them, a line of officials stood in a conference room, literally watching over their shoulders as Werner and Stonegross debugged the code. "Not to put any pressure on you," Malarski quipped at one point, "but it'd be great if you could get it running soon." Finally, by evening, the traffic to their sinkhole began to rise. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Bogachev logged in. The attack had interrupted his weekend, but at first, he probably didn't think much of it. Having weathered previous attempts to seize control of his botnet, he was used to fending off attacks. However, this time, he doesn't know what we've done. That night, Bogachev geared up for battle again, fighting for control of his network, testing its defenses, redirecting traffic to new servers, and analyzing the Pittsburgh team's method of attack. It was cyber hand-to-hand combat, says David Hickton, the US attorney in Pittsburgh. It was incredible to watch.
The team was able to intercept Bogachev's communication channels without his knowledge,
successfully knocking out his Turkish proxy server. Then they watched as he scrambled to regain control,
attempting to use the anonymizing service, Tor,
in a desperate bid to assess the damage. After hours of futile counterattacks, Slavic finally went quiet. It seemed the scale of the operation had caught him off guard. Realizing that the attack was more than just another botnet takedown, he fell silent. He must have realized it was law enforcement, Stonegross recalls. By Sunday night, nearly 60 hours into the operation, the team knew they had won. On Monday, June 2nd, the FBI and Justice Department publicly announced the takedown and unsealed a 14-count indictment against Bogachev. In the weeks that followed,
Slavic and the researchers continued to go back and forth.
For instance, Slavic timed one of his counterattacks while Werner and Stonegross were presenting at a conference in Montreal, but ultimately, the duo prevailed. Remarkably, 2 years later, the takedown held. The Game Over botnet never reassembled, although about 5,000 computers worldwide remain infected with Zeus malware. The industry partners, including CrowdStrike and others, continue to maintain the server sinkhole that absorbs the traffic from those infected machines. For nearly a year after the takedown, account takeover fraud in the US virtually vanished. Prior to the takedown, investigators had assumed that a wide network of gangs was behind the relentless wave of fraud that had plagued the industry from 2012 to 2014. In truth, however, most of those crimes were the work of just a small group, the so-called business club. You come into this thinking they're everywhere, Peterson reflects, but it turns out it's a tiny network, and they're much easier to disrupt than you think. In 2015, the US State Department offered a $3 million reward for information leading to the capture of Evgeniy Bogachev, the highest bounty ever posted for a cyber criminal at the time.
Yet, despite the massive incentive, he remains elusive. US intelligence sources indicate that contrary to popular belief,
the US government does not suspect Bogachev was involved in the Russian campaign to interfere with the 2016 US election. Instead, his inclusion in the Obama administration's sanctions was a tactic to exert pressure on the Russian government. The hope was that with his botnet dismantled, Russia might be willing to hand him over as a gesture of goodwill. Alternatively, the hope is that, with the $3 million reward now publicly offered, someone will step forward with information and help the FBI close the case. But the reality is that Bogachev and other Russian cyber criminals are beyond the reach of US authorities. The lingering mysteries surrounding the Game Over operation, such as Bogachev's possible ties to Russian intelligence and the full scale of his thefts, which are estimated in the hundreds of millions, highlight the complexities that face investigators probing cybercrime. This same uncertainty is likely to affect those investigating more recent breaches, such as the DNC hack, which is reportedly being handled by the FBI's Pittsburgh field office. Meanwhile, Malarski's team and the cybersecurity industry have shifted focus to emerging threats. The tactics that Bogachev pioneered are now standard, with ransomware spreading at an alarming rate. Today's botnets are even more formidable than those created by Bogachev. As for Bogachev himself, tips continue to trickle in about his whereabouts, but so far, there's no sign of his re-emergence, at least not yet.